Amen. Amen. Thank you, brother. All right. Daniel chapter 11, we have been going through a world history lesson here over the last week or so, and it does get a little confusing, but I'll go ahead and just reiterate a few things to you. If you read this and you're hearing what all I'm saying, I'm talking about the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire, and we're talking about the end of Alexander the Great and how his kingdom was split into four different kingdoms and all these kind of things. And you listen to this and you may say, "Preacher, I thought we were here to learn the Bible. What in the world does any of this have to do with, how could this be important? How is this really something I need to know about?" And I will admit to you, strictly from a worldly, earthly perspective, there are a lot of things that most of us learned in history class growing up that took precedent over this, right? Most of us in here, we know who Alexander the Great is, right? We don't know who Seleucus IV is, and we don't know who, Antiochus III is, at least most. Some of you, maybe you had like a, I don't know, maybe you minored in, ancient Judean history or something like that in college, but I don't think so. More often than not, we just don't know these people. And so automatically our old human brain kind of goes, well, this can't be all that important, and this was just happening in one little place on the earth. There's much bigger events that have taken place in human history. And yet, I would stress to you this morning that this is extremely important for one great big reason. The Lord said it's important. Amen? This is literally what He chose to highlight about human history in His Word. This is one of few things. You think about this. The Lord spends less than a chapter talking about how He made the earth. Right? He spends less than a chapter. You know what you and I would do if we were writing a book, if we were God and we were writing a book? We would be like, listen, here's how I made carbon, right? We would have broken that thing down. We'd have had 5 books just on how we did that. But not the Lord. He says, that's nothing. He focuses more on this, right? And so we ought to give it the same importance that the Lord gives to it. Now, you ask the question, why does the Lord give this importance? You might answer that. We talked about it a little bit last week. Does anybody remember why these guys are chosen to be highlighted? Why we're talking about their empires? What was it? It crosses over Israel, right? Now, I'll be the first to say this. Ptolemy the First didn't really care about Israel, right? It was nothing but a little backwater as far as he was concerned. It was just a bunch of conquered people that he was happening to be ruling over. Seleucus II, he probably didn't care at all, hardly, about those territories down there in Israel. But who does care about them? The Lord sure cares about it. He said that spot right there is holy ground. That is a spot that is reserved for His earthly people, the Jews. And so for that reason, even though these guys didn't care much about it, these guys had an effect on this place. They ruled over this place, so He is giving us some information on them. So just to do a little bit of a follow-up, we saw last week, there in about verse 5 and 6 or so, we talked about how Alexander the Great dies, and he leaves behind a pretty enormous empire. Now, I haven't drawn it all up here, and I don't have the room or the space, anything to be able to do that, but obviously Greece is somewhere over here, right? It's out here in the Mediterranean Sea. It's over here, it's sticking out, down from southern Europe. Obviously, Alexander the Great, the seat of his power, where he originates, is right over here. But he, after getting attacked by the Persians, he attacks back, and he goes all the way into Turkey. He goes down here into the Middle East. He takes over a good portion of northern Africa, and he even goes over beyond the Middle East, down into what is modern-day Turkey, and all the way up to parts of southwestern Russia and southeastern Europe. So he actually conquers an enormous swath of land, right? And yet, as a young man, he dies, gives up the ghost, and through the course of events, he does not leave it behind to his heirs. It ends up going to 4 of his generals. Now, those 4 kingdoms get split up. Obviously, you have Macedonia, Greece, that's the original kingdom that's still there. You have Thrace, which is up here in Turkey and kind of goes up north a little bit up into Europe. But then you have the Seleucid Empire. Let me get my marker. There we go. You have over here the Seleucid Empire. And you have down here the Ptolemaic Empire. I had to check my spelling. The Ptolemaic Empire. Does everybody remember this from last week? Okay. These are really the only ones, for the most part, that the Lord deals with in Daniel chapter 11. Why? Once again, I just want to really get this ingrained into you. We've already talked about it. Why is that? Thrace never one time ruled over this. Macedon never one time ruled over that spot right there. But these guys sure fought over it, right? They went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, fighting across the land of Israel. So that's the reason the Lord highlights them here. Now, Ptolemy the First, he is right here. He sets up his kingdom down in Alexandria, Egypt. He rules from right here in what we know as Egypt, and he actually goes out beyond the Sinai Peninsula a little ways. He was one of Alexander the Great's primary generals, and he had a general that kind of ruled under him by the name of Seleucus. Seleucus, later, after helping Ptolemy get into power down here, he branches off and he begins the Seleucid Empire over here, which ends up being the largest of those empires. Now, you saw that last week over there in verse 5, there at the end of the verse. What did it say? His dominion shall be a great dominion. That's a reference to Seleucid. He actually winds up having a greater territory. He rules all this all the way down toward India. So he has got the largest portion of Alexander's old kingdom. And for the most part, when Ptolemy the First and Seleucus the First, when they are reigning, there's not perfect peace. There never is, right? But they really aren't fighting just yet. But as things happen, Ptolemy dies, Seleucus dies, and they both have sons. Now, Ptolemy has a son that goes by the name of Ptolemy the Second. There you go, pretty easy. And then Seleucus has a son who goes by the title of Antiochus the First. So Antiochus is now ruling the Seleucid Empire. Ptolemy the First is now ruling the Ptolemaic Empire. Now, these two guys, they start the fighting. Next, you know, these guys, they don't have a relationship. They're not like Ptolemy and Seleucus the First. And so they start to battle back and forth over this border right here. And to be honest, I've not done a whole lot with this just because it just goes back and forth. It's just moving back. These guys are fighting nonstop throughout their reign. But finally, there comes a day where they say, listen, we've got to stop this fighting. We need to have some peace. And so Ptolemy says, you know what? Ptolemy the Second says, you know what? I've got a son. Or I have a daughter. So I have a daughter. Ptolemy the First says, or Ptolemy the Second says, I have a daughter. And Antiochus the First says, well, you know what? I've got a son. And so he gives his daughter, Ptolemy the Second, gives his daughter Bernice, or Berenice, to Antiochus the First's son. The only problem is his son is already married. Y'all remember this? Now look down about verse 7. Verse 6. In the end of the years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south, Ptolemy, shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. So that is a reference to the fact Ptolemy II gives his daughter to the son of Antiochus the First. He divorces his old wife, right? He divorces her, Laodice, disinherits her children, and puts Bernice on the throne with him and her children as his new heirs. What do you think Laodice thinks about this? Not a happy camper. And she liked being in power. She liked the fact that her son was going to one day rule on the throne, and she's not happy about it. So she starts to conspire against her husband, Ptolemy II, her husband, Antiochus the First. This is where I get it mixed up. She starts to conspire against Antiochus, and in the course of events, his son, I'll get there eventually, starts to conspire against his son, and in doing so, she has him killed, Bernice killed, and their child and their son killed. And she, Bernice, puts her son, Seleucus II, on the throne. So now you see the succession. You have Seleucus I, his son Antiochus, the first, but instead of Antiochus's original son getting on there, Seleucus the second ends up being the one who gets on the throne here. So, Seleucus the second gets on the throne, but what does Ptolemy over here think about that? What happened to his daughter? It killed his daughter, right? And he's an old man. He actually dies before he can do anything about it. But guess what? She has a brother, Ptolemy III, that comes to power. Ptolemy III says, you killed my sister. And so he gets a big old army together, and he says, I'm going to invade here. Let me find a. He says, I'm going to invade up into the Seleucid Empire. He said, I'm going up there, and I'm going to teach them I'm going to teach them a thing or two. I'm going to teach them to kill my sister, right? I'll show them what happens when you mess with the Ptolemies. So, verse 7 and 8. But out of a branch of her root shall one stand up in his estate, that's Ptolemy III, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north. He goes up to where Seleucid is, and he goes up there to the Seleucid Empire. He goes up to the king of the north and shall deal against them and shall prevail, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So sure enough, Ptolemy II, he goes up here, and he doesn't stop. He goes up this way, and he goes straight up past the Tigris River, up to the very capital of the Seleucid Empire. He invades them. He leaves the king on the throne, but he takes everything he's got, right? He takes all the silver and the gold, and much of the artifacts that Nebuchadnezzar and other kings had taken up this way, they get taken back down to Egypt, which is exactly what the Lord said would happen back there in verse 7 and 8, right? He goes up there and he gets all their gods and their treasures of silver and gold, and he brings them back with him. So now Ptolemy has overtaken the land. Now, this all seems like just, okay, this one didn't like this one, and that one didn't like that one, and they fought back and forth and everything. And so you can easily get into reading this and just go, come on, preacher, what does this have to do with anything? Here's what it has to do with, and here's why I've done some of these in green up here. Right here, you don't have a lot of fighting. You actually have Seleucus, who is ruling most of what would be Israel. But considering the fact that they weren't really fighting over it and it wasn't completely under his rulership, I don't put either of them. But by the time you get to Antiochus I, they fight in war, he gets full ownership of Israel, of Judea, right? That's why I put him in green. Over here, it changes hands. Ptolemy III comes up through here, and on his route to attacking the Seleucid Empire, what does he also wind up now obtaining? He gets Israel. He's traveling up through Israel to get there. He takes all of this. So all of a sudden now it's changed hands. The Ptolemaic Empire now is governing Israel. By the time you get to about verse 7, verse number 8. Ultimately, Ptolemy III outlives Seleucus II by about 4 years. So if you look down there, I think the end of verse 8, he shall continue more years than the king of the north, comes to pass on the money, just like the Bible said it would. By the way, hundreds of years before it would ever take place, right? He happens to just barely outlive, Seleucus II. So now Ptolemy III leaves his son on the throne, Ptolemy IV, and Seleucus leaves his son, Antiochus, I need an S on there, Antiochus III. And that is where we are now getting into verse number 9. So verse 9, the Bible says this, so the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. But his sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overthrow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. So, we're finally now getting into some new ground. This can be a bit confusing. Look there at verse 9 again. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land, but his sons shall be stirred up. Whose sons? The king of the north or the king of the south? See where the problem comes up? His sons shall be stirred up and shall assemble, and one shall certainly come. Who's this one that's going to come? You start to get into all this, and it's talking about his and one and his and this one, and you don't know who his refers to, right? So here's one case where actually a slight knowledge of the history that went on helps you to understand more of what is taking place here in the text, right? So here is what's taking place. Number one, the king of the south in verse number 9, we clearly know who that refers to. It is just literally talking about in verse 9 kind of a recap of what Ptolemy did, or a recap of what Ptolemy the third did in verse 4 or verse 7, verse 8. Now, in verse 10, it talks about his sons. That's where it really starts to get confusing. It is not talking about Ptolemy the third's sons. It's talking about Seleucus II's sons. See, Seleucus II has two boys, and they are not happy that their daddy lost all this nice territory in here, right? And they want it back, as one might expect. And so they start to raise up an army. Now, one of his sons is Seleucus III. As you'll note, Seleucus III is not on here, is he? Right? The other son is Antiochus III. He is on there. I'm going to ask you a little trick question just to make sure y'all are still paying attention, but why do you suppose that Antiochus III is, but Seleucus III is not? You got it right the first time. Seleucus III is helping raise an army along with his brother Antiochus III, but one of Seleucus III's generals conspires against him and kills him before they can ever actually start the expedition against the Ptolemaic Empire, right? So now Antiochus III has not only his own army that he has raised, but he has his brother's army that he raised before he dies. And they now go and they march to the south, they march to the southwest, down toward the Ptolemaic Empire. And they are extremely successful. Matter of fact, go down through here. They are extremely successful to the point that they drive all the way back into here and pretty much take back every bit of territory that they had lost in the previous war, right? And he marches straight down through there, and he gets all the way down there, all the way down to the city of Ratha, where Ptolemy IV is now reigning, and Ptolemy IV defends the city of Raphia, which is right down about here, near Gaza. You ever heard about the Gaza Strip? Raphia is right about here, right at the very southern part of Israel. There's this enormous battle that takes place, and despite the fact that Antiochus III has the larger army, Ptolemy IV actually winds up winning the battle. And so he stops them from being able to invade all the way down into the Ptolemaic Empire. So you sit here and you watch this and you go, well, preacher, why are both of these guys in green? Well, because at different times, both of them actually ruled during their reign. Both of them actually ruled over Israel. See what I'm saying? He comes down, now all of a sudden Antiochus III has it, but formerly Ptolemy had it. And Ptolemy stops him right about there at the border, right? And so Ptolemy goes back to his own land, and he celebrates, and he keeps celebrating, and he basically just takes a lot of pride in the strength of his victory and his army. He gets drunk all the time and gets involved in great debauchery and just basically does nothing with this amazing victory that he had at Raphia. And so if you look there at verse number 9 through 11, the king of the south, verse 11, shall be moved with choler, shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, and he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. The idea is the king of the south comes up to meet this great multitude, and it's given into his hand. That's exactly what we just saw, right? Ptolemy comes up here, meets him in battle, and beats that much greater force. But, verse 12, and when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. For the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. By the way, who's thy people in that verse? Who's he talking to? This is the angel. Remember, this is the appearance of the Lord talking to Daniel, right? So who's thy people? It's Jews, right? It's Jewish people. He says, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. You say, preacher, what in the world is all this talking about? Let me describe it to you. Ptolemy IV, this guy right here, remember him? He wins at Raphia, but he goes back, as I said just a few minutes ago, he goes back and he says, listen, let's eat, drink, and be merry. We are in power. They couldn't defeat us. We whooped their army even though it was bigger than us. And so I'm just going to live off that victory for the rest of my days and enjoy myself and have a big drunken party, right? How do you suppose the Egyptian people, the people of his empire, felt about that? Not a very popular ruler, right? And so here's where we start to see what happens in verse 12 through 16. History tells us that he took comfort in the strength of his military and began to live a life of excess and debauchery, which resulted in a rebellion that cost him over half his kingdom. So Ptolemy IV, even though he had one great victory, he goes down in history as being a terrible leader. Like the idea is, hey, we did one thing right, let's just kind of sit back and rest and relax and do nothing else. And his people rebel. Say, listen, you're not doing nearly what your father and your grandfather did, right? And they're angry and they rebel against him. He ultimately dies. Ptolemy IV dies. Antiochus III says, okay, you might have beat me at Raphia, but I'm coming back. Which, by the way, if you read verse 12, 13, 14, 15, around in there, he's not going to stay up there in Seleucia. He's coming back. The army was coming back to attack again. But this time, Antiochus III gathers several kingdoms together with him. He gets Macedon to help him. And he gets some of these other kingdoms up in Thrace to come down and help him. So he builds an even greater army and goes back and invades down here again. And this time, they're victorious. But there's one thing that stops them from going straight into the Ptolemaic Empire and just taking the whole thing over. You won't know the answer to this, but if anybody's just an amazing history nut, maybe you'll know. Does anybody know what stopped him? It wasn't a military thing that stopped him. And it wasn't death. Politics stopped him. Does anybody want to know which? Maybe this is a better way to ask it. What kingdom told Antiochus III, you can't invade? There's a kingdom on the rise at this point in history that is starting to come to power that he doesn't want to mess with. Rome. The Romans have come to power, right? And they're starting to Rome is here, somewhere in this area. And Rome has started to rise to power, and they now, even though they're not taking everybody over just yet, their influence is pretty enormous, and their army is getting to be well known, and Antiochus III doesn't want to mess with them. And so they send a message to him, and they say, whoa, hold up, buddy. You don't get to go all the way down into Egypt. We've got some friendships down there, and we got some business connections down there, and we don't need you going down there and messing things up. And so what does he do? He stops. And instead of invading down into Egypt, Antiochus III decides, well, as a consolation prize, I'm going to go up here and attack Cilicia and the area up here in southeastern Turkey, which is modern-day southeastern Turkey. He takes that area and he claims it from the rest of the Greek Empire, from Thrace and some of those kingdoms. He claims that area now for the Seleucid Empire. By the way, he changes their their capital at that time. What's his name? And he changes their capital to a little city right here known as Antioch, which the believers were first called at Antioch. Our King James Bible, as opposed to a lot of the other Bible translations, pretty much almost all of them, it actually traces its lineage back to Antioch, whereas where do the other ones trace it back to? Alexandria, Egypt, down here, right? So a little bit of interesting history how this is going to begin to tie into the New Testament. So Antiochus gets mad because he can't go into Egypt, so he goes north instead, and he whoops some people up there in Turkey, and he takes that area up there. So you look down at verse number, let me find it. There we go, verse 15. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. So he has fought his way down to here. Now he's fighting his way up here. Who's getting pretty much stomped all over throughout this? Israel right here. So he goes up, he's taking all the fenced cities, and he goes up here and he takes the cities up in here as well. And these people are all caught right in the middle of all this. So they're getting killed, their buildings are getting demolished, their homes are getting burnt down. They have armies marching through and taking over all their things. That's a lot of what verse 14, 15, 16 are getting at. Now there is one other thing to note here, and that is verse 14. He mentioned the robbers of thy people. We already said the fact that the robbers of thy people is pretty obviously here the Jews. And so you go, well, who are the robbers of thy people? I'm going to be the first person to tell you, I don't exactly know. I don't know. Whatever they're doing, verse 14, they're trying to exalt themselves to establish the vision. So they're either knowingly or unknowingly doing something to fulfill prophecy. It's kind of the idea there, right? They're establishing the vision. If it is who I think it is, I think they were doing it unknowingly. I don't think they were sitting here trying to do it. There's a group during this time that when Ptolemy still had this territory over here in Israel, he had a group there in Jerusalem, and that group was a bunch of Jews known as the Tobiads, Tobiads, the Tobiads. Tobiads were a family of Jews that sided with Ptolemy, and because they collected taxes for Ptolemy of their own people, he gave them great power and great wealth and great influence, right? What do you think the rest of the Jews thought of them? They hated their guts, right? And so one of the things that Antiochus III did when he came back through this area is, what do you think happened to those Tobiads who were loyal to Ptolemy? Antiochus said, y'all are out. He kills them, and he takes away their power, and he actually puts his own people in charge of Jerusalem. He actually sets up authority over Jerusalem. Best way I can figure, if those are the robbers, in other words, they were robbing their own people, right? If that's who it's talking about, the robbers of thy people, history would kind of suggest that they drew attention to Jerusalem that otherwise Antiochus wouldn't have even paid. See what I'm saying? So as a result of them even being there and doing what they were doing, it brought him up through there, which fulfilled Bible prophecy. So that could be it. But I'll be the first person to say, let me raise my hand, listen loud and clear. I don't know. I think that's probably what that could possibly be talking about. Verse 16, and I'm probably going to have to finish up here pretty soon. Verse 16. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the ford of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So, once again, it gets a little bit confusing. But in verse 16, he says, he that cometh against him. In that instance, it appears to be a reference to Antiochus III again. Once again, kind of like a recap. We've been talking about Antiochus. Now he's attacking. He's going against everybody, right? Well, it's like it's just restating that there in verse 16. And so he has come against the king of the south, and but this time around he's going to include more information regarding, what did he say? The glorious land, right? Verse 16. He shall stand in the glorious land. So it's like the first time through, as we look there at verse 12 to verse 15 or so, that time through, he just refers to kind of the general battles. He goes down, fights them, can't go in, so he goes up north and he takes the fenced cities. But now it's going to describe a little bit more about the fact that he dwells in the glorious land. That reference to Israel in this case. The Lord's not calling anywhere else glorious on this earth. Matter of fact, the only place on this earth he says anything good about is Israel. Sorry, friends, not even America. It doesn't say a good thing about us. So you say, what in the world takes place here? Well, Antiochus III has a daughter who ends up being known as Cleopatra. Before everybody goes, oh, wait, I know that one. Not that Cleopatra. Cleopatra that all of you all are thinking of, Mark Antony, all that kind of stuff, you know, Shakespeare plays, stuff like that. That Cleopatra, I think, is Cleopatra the 7th, if I remember correctly. This is Cleopatra so Cleopatra that you're thinking of is a little ways away, right? She's got a couple of generations to go before she's showing up. But Cleopatra is honestly more of a title that was given to the women rulers of the Ptolemaic Empire, because they were down here in Egypt, right? So in order to try to influence Ptolemy, remember the Romans wouldn't let Antiochus III go down here. So in order to try to kind of take over in a more subtle way, what does he do? He says, well, Ptolemy, I mean, come on, man. You've got a, let me find my thing here. It says, Ptolemy, come on, man. I mean, you've got a son, right? You've got a son. He's about to come to the throne. I've got a daughter. Let's just marry them together and we'll make peace, right? We'll be one family, one great big family. The only problem is he marries his daughter off to Ptolemy V, but who is she loyal to? She's loyal to her husband or her daddy. Look at look down here. I want y'all to get it just so you see it. Verse, let me find it, 17. He gives the daughter of women away, gives his daughter away, but she won't be for him, and she won't stay with him. In other words, it doesn't achieve what Antiochus wants it to achieve. He gives her to this guy saying, all right, I'll have influence now. But who does she ultimately stand behind? Her husband. She says, all right, no, Daddy, tough luck, I'm gone, buddy. she says, and she sends Daddy packing, right, and tells him not to call anymore. And she is loyal to Ptolemy. So it disrupts Antiochus's plan, right? So he's pretty upset now. He now doesn't have any influence over the Ptolemaic Empire. So he decides, well, I still want to spread out. I still want to grow. So he declares war on Thrace and Macedon. Basically Greece and Turkey, right? And he decides he's going to spread out. And he gets a fleet of 300 ships and begins to go out here and start attacking the islands and the different coastal towns out here. He goes by sea and starts to branch out here into the Mediterranean to try and go and take over the rest of the, I guess what you might call the former Greek Empire, right? Which, once again, what does it say in verse 18? After this, he shall turn his face unto the isles. He's going out into the islands, the coastal towns, right? He's going out there and he attacks them, and he shall take many of them. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. A Roman general says, I don't much like you trying to come over here our way and take over things that we have influence over, right? And so a Roman general by the name of Scipio Asiaticus, say that 5 times fast. Scipio Asiaticus, he goes and he attacks Antiochus III's forces beats them handily, and causes Antiochus to have to go back to Antioch of Syria over here, back to the capital, and give up on his war against Macedon and Thrace. He has to give up almost all of his land holdings. So not only does he lose all this stuff over here that he took, he actually has to give up some of this in here. They pretty much put him under tribute, right? And the Romans say, listen here, buddy, you ain't going to attack our people. You're not going to attack our interests. And so they send him packing. They force him to have to pay them and have to actually give up the vast majority of his power. So Antiochus is pretty interesting. At the beginning of his reign, I mean, he's just about taken over everything. And yet by the end of it, he has caused, to some extent, he has caused the Seleucid Empire to almost just decline to almost nothing, right? And so Antiochus III signs a peace treaty with Rome that cost him much of his kingdom, and he not only lost the land, but he's put to tribute. Unhappy with their losses, Antiochus III is then killed by his own people. Look at verse 19. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, and he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So Antiochus III gets killed right there in Antioch in the fort of his own land, his own capital, right? At the end of his life. So I'm going to leave it right there for the sake of time this morning. Any questions, concerns? Yes, sir?